this is a talk about controllers, so I'm not sure what the criteria for talks for this conference was, but entertainment clearly wasn't one of them. So the format of the talk, first half, move non-web stuff out of web, second half, umbrellas, done. So the default Phoenix structure, this is what happens when you run mixphoenix.new. You end up with an application where most of the code's in web. You'll have some files in lib, you'll have like your endpoint in there, your repo in there, like your application entry point will be in there, you'll maybe some gen servers and stuff, but there's a lot of stuff in web. And it'll be split into like controllers, models, views, and templates. There's also channels in there, there's like a static directory, and it's all the stuff that's kind of web related and it all goes in there. But some of the stuff maybe shouldn't be. So it looks like this. If you can't read it, and just use your imagination, but the lib directory is pretty bare, and the web directory is pretty full. And there's a models directory in there, and there's templates and things. And this is from an application that I'd already built, so there's some stuff in there as well, some in the templates directory. So let's talk about what a controller is. So it's kind of the glue code between like your model and your view. And I'll talk about what I mean by a model and a view as well, not a view. A view is like, something that outputs either HTML or JSON. And your model is like your domain model. So the controller should really focus on your web layer. So when you have an HTTP request comes in via Cowboy, it will go through it will start in the endpoint, and there'll be a series of plugs in there. And then they'll do things like parse the body and log to the output. And then there'll be, like, at the end, it's usually your router in there, and then your router has a series of plugs. You may, like, guard a set of routes behind authentication in there, validate your formats and things. And then at the end of your router, there'll be a match somewhere in there that will point to a plug, which could be a controller action, which is a form plug. And then you'll get into your controller, and you'll do some stuff in there. Maybe you'll look up some entries, and you'll store them on assigns. Then you'll eventually hit action, and action will call your function, which could be like show or update or delete or whatever. And so it's kind of manipulating this plug.construct all the way through the request. Sockets and channels are kind of similar, but for different purposes. So they don't interface with plug.con, but they're for like real time. And the same problems I talk about here will probably also appear in there. It's not entirely web specific. I'm going at this from a web angle because Phoenix, but there are other applications where this applies. So a controller isn't, though. It's not like the direct interface into your database. So it's not to say you can't manipulate things in the database from your controller. You just shouldn't do it directly. There are other ways. You should maybe have an abstraction in there. And I'll give some examples as I go through. So the one thing that I maybe want to start advocating is to stop using repo and controller. This doesn't mean if you already have an application, don't go and like phone your team and be like, we need to rewrite this now. The world is on fire. It's fine, but it's just something you should keep in mind, as you go forward. So here's the output of grep, and I'm grepping for repo in my web directory, and you'll see that it appears in several of the controllers, and there's also an alias for it in web.ex, which gets included by everything. I meant to do this at the start, but can I just get a show of hands for who's used Phoenix before? Okay, that's a lot. Who's used umbrellas before? Okay, who's used both? All right, well, you guys enjoy your early lunch. So removing repo out of control has a 100% success rate because this one person has tweeted me. And they said it was a great suggestion. It's been a massive improvement in their app. And so far, no one has tweeted me going, Gazler, I hate you. This is the worst idea ever. So it's, it's proven, definitely. So let's talk about why repo's in control in the first place. It's got in there, and somehow people have kind of decided that's where it should end up at the moment. Here's the Phoenix guys. They're maintained by the Phoenix core team, so I fall into that category. And you'll see that I've put a piece in bold. It's not in bold in the guides, by the way. That's me doing that so that you can see which part I'm talking about. And it's the repo.insert, and this is the create action of a controller that looks like it creates a user. Here is a screenshot from GitHub where, again, the code in bold, it uses repo. This is the generator for like the HTML generator, and it uses repo throughout. Repo is the storage mechanism from Ecto, by the way, if you're not familiar with it. This is a pretty popular Phoenix book. Several places in that it shows the same thing. Like it has a controller, and in there it'll get a change set, and it'll insert a record, and then do something based on the result. Not the most popular Phoenix book, though. This is clearly the most popular Phoenix book. And here's a chart from that book. And, and here's an answer from Stack Overflow that I gave, so I can't really blame everyone else for this. The question is, should I use Secto repo and controller model for Elixir Phoenix? And my first line, it's in bold here. Again, not in bold in the actual question or the answer. I've done that for dramatic effect. But it says you should keep your repo calls inside your controller. I'm using those exact words. I then go on to say if your logic's complicated, then you should consider moving the logic out into like a service module. So maybe I should go back and delete that answer or modify it to take out the first line, and that would mean I wouldn't have to show this slide, but I've shown it now. So what is repo and controller? We, the Phoenix core team, people who give advice on this, lots of blog post guides and things said it should be. But things evolve. Here is a screenshot of a tweet of a photo of a slide from Chris McCord's keynote. And it's the new generators in Phoenix 1.3. And you'll see the web directory is now inside of lib. So before web was in the root, it was like this special directory, and people were confused. They'd be like, oh, so which code goes in web and which goes in lib? And the answer would kind of dodge around and be like, well, if you need it to recompile and reload, then put it in web because we can recompile that directory. And if not, put it in lib. But that's no longer the case as of Phoenix 1.2. So now the answer is just put it in lib. And as of Phoenix 1.3, there'll be this lib web directory. This is just the default, so Phoenix itself hasn't changed. It's just the generators. And you'll see the assets directories in the root as well. So this would have been like your web static assets, your node module, and so on. So I want to introduce you to an application now. It's called World of Grand Theft Pokemon Go 2.0. When I came up with this, I didn't think it'd be the second World of Warcraft reference today, but it is. Anyone who was at my ElixirConf US talk and saw my tic-tac-toe application there, this is totally different. This is noughts and crosses. Okay, speaker notes. So here is the application, and it's pretty stylish. I'm logged in as two users here. On the left, I'm logged in as user@example.com, and on the right, I'm logged in as gazler@gmail.com. You can tell that because I've just told you. And if you look here, there's a list of challenges, and there's no challenges available yet. And then I'll hit this new challenge button, and it goes into this state where I've used a UUID, so it ruins the layout. And it's waiting for another player to join, so I've issued a challenge here. I'm showing this mainly for context, but also just to pad the talk out a bit. So now if we look at this challenge, I can join. Here's a challenge. Which one of these games do you let's go with this. Nailed it, first time. So the X always goes first, and the way I would randomize it is the one user will be allocated each one randomly. So the X's can only go on their turn. Look, I can't promise. I'm clicking there. But I can go on the X's, and then the nodes. This is pretty cool, right? It's a gen server in the background that maintains the state. I did a whole talk about it that you can go and watch when the videos are up, because I'm not going to go over here. And the game continues until someone's declared the winner, like that. And yeah, that's the game. Yeah. So let's talk about how not to not repo. So what we can do is we can create functions in like a context. This is that service module I mentioned in my my Stack Overflow answer, but with a better name. So a context is like a module that has a group of kind of related functions in there that will do something that involves your domain. And it should do everything that's not directly web related. So as an example, taking an HTTP request, probably web related. Saving to the database, not web related. Sending an email, probably not web related. Tracking to statsd, not web related unless you're tracking the stats of your HTTP request, in which case the measuring of it's web related, but the tracking of it's not. So a good way to start doing this is just delete your repo alias in web.ex and watch your compile errors just grow. And then you can go and fix them. And xref will tell you as well, like if the module no longer points to a function that exists. So let's talk about registering a user, which is a pretty common workflow in an application. So here's a controller action. It's the create action. The bottom of this slide is not important, probably. And we split. So we've got these params that come in. These will be the HTTP params. And what we're doing is we're splitting on them. So the email and the password go to these auth params, and the other params go into the player params. And I like to do this split in my application because you've got this internal representative or user or player, and that'll be like what you use for your foreign keys for the games and the challenges. But then you've got this authentication, which is separate. And if you split this way from the start, when you want to bring in a new authentication mechanism like I don't know, OAuth or LDAP, then you can do that pretty easily, and all your foreign keys will still work, so you don't have like a massive update to do. So in order for this to work, we need both entries to be valid, otherwise we don't want to register that user. So we start a transaction, and we try and insert like the account, which is the authentication credentials. If that succeeds, then we'll then generate this player, which is kind of what my user is. It's kind of more specific to this application. And we take the account ID that we got before, and we insert, and then if that succeeds, then we'll take the email from the registration and add it on the player. So let's assume that's like a virtual attribute or something. And if anything fails, we roll back. And then if you're wondering what the last lines do, we pipe that to case. And if it succeeds, then we redirect and say, hey, OK, you've registered, now log in. And there's another case there that's the error, and that will re-render the form. So if we move this from the controller will end up looking like this. So there's a lot less in there. We're still splitting. So this time we're matching particular arguments out of the map, the email and the password. And we have this accounts.register player function, which takes the email, password, and the params. And there's not a mention of repo here at all. And then we've got this accounts module, and in here we've got this register player function, takes an email, password, and player params. I'm using Ecto Multi here because I wanted to talk about it, and I need to crowbar it in somewhere. So this kind of works the same way as the transaction before, but Ecto Multi is, I guess you can think of it like a pipeline for your database. So there are functions like insert and delete on there. And the first argument's like a name, and the second, in this case, the function. The argument in the first case I'm ignoring, but that's the result of the multi so far. So in my first thing, I'm calling this other module, auth.register. I haven't shown the implementation, but let's assume it creates a user. And then in the second function, I'm grabbing the account, same as before, and creating a new player that is associated to that account. And then I'm just calling repo insert there. And I then pipe this through to repo transactions, so same case applies. If either one fails, the entire transaction is rolled back. And then this other function, handle new registration. So this is another part of it that we're using. If it succeeds, then we get OK results, which is the result of the Ecto Multi. And we, again, attach the email like we did before, because it's a virtual attribute, and we send an email of some sort to the player, say, welcome to the best game ever. Hope you enjoy your stay. And then we return OK player. And that's the same as the controller I was using before, so I haven't had to change that part of the controller. And if it fails, then you get a forpl with the error, the name of the thing that caused the error, then the change set, and then the result of the multi so far. And I only care about the error in the change set, so that's what I want to return. So that's what the controller expects. And now we've got this module called accounts, which is like the context. So this is like our domain. This is the stuff that's specific to my application. I want to register an account and a player. And this kind of contains all the database logic, but it also handles the email and transforms the response so it can be used by the controller. And it's also leveraging this other context as well. So you can use more than two. You can use as many as you want and call other functions. They are just functions. And the benefits here is like our domain is no longer tied to our controller or our web interface at all. So it means we can provide other interfaces into the function. We could have a mixed task, for example, mixed register user. We could use a more exotic technique, and by exotic I mean old, like telnet or email. So I'm not advocating that you handle user registration via email, but you could. But the most important thing in my opinion is like you can test this now without your web tier. So before you'd have all these tests in your controller that will go off and register the user and check that the user's in the database or however you're testing it. Maybe you try and log in and then that works. And that's still a valid test. You may still want to keep it around. But you've got all these other edge cases you need to consider. What happens if an account fails? What happens if a player fails? And now you can test these in isolation in the accounts module test, which is a very powerful testing technique. So I've got a few more of these examples. They all introduce something new, so I'm not going to go through the entire application, but everything should hopefully bring a new thing. So this one here, I'm getting the current user, so let's assume I've got a plug somewhere that takes the ID that's stored in the session and fetches the authentication from it. So this is authentication, not the player. And then we'll go through the deleted code first, which is in red. So we preload the player from that authentication, and then we fetch all the challenges that are open. So this is where, if I go back to the application, still looks awesome. And if I create a challenge here and then view it, you'll see that I don't see my own challenges. I only see the challenge from the other user. So there's a piece of code in there that says, that second part of the query which says not my ID. And they're all open as well. So that challenge, there were two for Gary Rennie, one of them was closed. And we preload the player as well so we can show their name. Now what we do is we get the challenge and what we're calling this accounts.getPlayer, which will take like an authentication struct and return the player from it. And we've got this game.listOpenChallenges function. And now it doesn't matter where our challenges are fetched from. They can be fetched from a database or MongoDB or like a gen server, or it could just be a static list. It really doesn't matter. You can, in fact, delete your whole implementation and start again, and you won't have to change this file, unless you delete like, the whole application or something. But when I say implementation, I mean the implementation of the listOpenChallenges function. And the other thing to know is it's called listOpenChallenges. It's not called like getAllChallenges. It's something that's I'm trying to convey what this function does in its name. So it will only list the open challenge. It doesn't get all the challenges. It's not like challenge index or something. And the implementations here are just the code that I deleted from the controller. I've only moved the code, and moving code in Elixir is very easy. And now we've got this game context, and again, it's got all the database logic, but could have other stuff in there as well. So here's another case. This one's different because before it was using Repo to insert exclamation mark function, or bang, and it before would build the challenges and insert them, and if it fails, then it would raise. And now we're calling this game.issueOpenChallenge function again with a bang, so it raises. And this is an easy case because there's no matching to do here, so we've kind of ported the function. And again, the function name is explicit. It's called issueOpenChallenge. It's not called like createChallenge. It's very explicit in what it's doing. So we still get this game context, but now it's no longer using the controller. So again, we get the testing benefits. One more, which is the close challenge. So this is what happens when it's got that waiting screen, and the other player comes in, and then both of them update over the WebSocket. I'm showing this one because it had a more complicated match in there, so try and bear with me. So it's getting the challenge, and then it's getting the current player ID. So let's assume we've got a plug somewhere that gets the player from the user or the authentication. And then we're matching on the challenge, and the first match says, if the player ID is my own ID, then it's my challenge, and it's fine. I'm totally allowed to see it. Something I didn't show is you can only have 2 players in a game, because if you ever played Noughts and Crosses with 3 people, doesn't really work. So what it's doing is it's signing the token and then rendering. And if it's a challenge that is someone else has issued, then we close the challenge and update. And for any other case, we say we couldn't find the challenge and we return. And we've replaced these top 2 matches here. Now we've got game.closeChallenge, which takes an ID and the player. And we'll return either OKChallenge or something else. And the close challenge function, again, we get the repo, we get the challenge from the database, and we match on it here, and return OKChallenge, which is your own. If it's someone else's challenge, we call this update challenge function, which I haven't shown here, but you can guess what it looks like. And for anything else, it's an error, and it's not found. So a quick summary of the way you can rename this. You want to remove the repo alias from your web.ex to cause compilation errors. Again, you can use grep liberally to see where you're using repo. This same thing, by the way, applies to channels and sockets. And it doesn't only apply to Phoenix or web applications. Like if you're using nerves or something, you want to isolate all your I/O with the device in different modules so that you don't have all this logic. Because in nerves, you have to boot to an SD card and burn it, and then take it out and plug it in, and then you boot it up and say, oh, this didn't work. Take it back out, put it back in. So you can save a lot of time doing this. And yeah, you just want to move it's usually just copy and pasting code out of the controller and into some other module, but you need to think about what the modules are called and what the functions are called. Do one control at a time as well. Don't try and do like everything at once, because you're going to have a bad time. And commit at the end as well. This is actually a Git talk with little bits of Elixir thrown in. So I will mention when to commit several times. So let's talk about models. Well, they're no longer called models. The thing that used to be a model in Ecto is now called a schema. Sometimes you kind of take things away from people that they used to have, and it causes outrage. Like for example, when the iPhone 7 took away Jack. Good. Twice as many people laughed that time, which means only half of you got the joke, which is fine. So let's talk about what a model is. It's kind of like a representation of your domain, hence the phrase domain model. So it's nothing really to do with your database tables. It can certainly leverage the database, and you can do database-related stuff in there. You can do leverage many transactions in there as well, like I was doing. I had the account and the player, and my domain model was responsible for doing both creations there. But it can do other things as well, like showed email, tracking to statsd, sending an SMS, calling to a gen server. It doesn't really matter, but it needs to kind of capture a part of your application. A schema, on the other hand, is a representation of your table row usually. It's a way of mapping from a database to an Elixir struct. And it can reference other schemas as well. So you've got things like has many belongs to, you've got embedded schemas in there, and you just reference the module that has the struct that it's using. And it can also perform data integrity validations. So these are things that are important before it gets persisted. So you may be like, a required field can't be blank, or something must be unique, which you back by database index. I probably wouldn't put things like you can't create this on a Tuesday in the schema. I would probably handle that elsewhere. It really depends. If your application is really going to fail, if you save something on a Tuesday, then maybe, but I would handle it elsewhere. So in order to change the models to schemas, like we could just move the models directory and call it schemas, and that would work, and that's fine. And you'd end up with files like schemas challenge and schemas player. But what we can do instead is we can nest these schemas in the context that is leveraging them. So for example, we'd have game challenge or we'd have accounts player. And you get this benefit then that you can see from the file kind of what it relates to. So a challenge relates to a game, and you maybe wouldn't get that if it was just in this one directory with 100 schemas in there. One potential downside of this that I've seen is you can't find out at a glance what your schema looks like. And that's true, but there are better tools. You can do an active schema dump or something if you want to just look at your schema. So you have other options there. And if you're really bothered, you could call these schema challenge or schema player, and then alias them whenever you use them. You also need to change model case to database case because model is going to be a bad word in your directory structure soon. So use something else. And when you've done all this, you'll have an application that looks like this. And again, if you can't see, what's basically happened is my lib directory has grown, and I've deleted models. The web directory is still in the root, by the way, here. So the next thing we need to do is move it. And you can do this with just these commands. You want to move your web static directory into there. You want to move your package.json, your node modules. You want to make sure you git ignore your node modules because there's probably about 4 million files in there, probably 4 million of the own file in there. So definitely add that to git ignore. You don't want to commit that, git talk. And then you want to move your root level web directory into the lib directory. And then here's a handy script. So what you should do is everything in the web directory should be namespaced from the name of the application. It's not actually World of Grand Theft Pokemon, whatever I called it. It's actually called OXO. And I've renamed all the modules in the web directory to oxo.web. And that'll make sense when we talk about umbrellas. And once you've done that, this is, again, so the web directory is now inside the lib. It's kind of at the same level as the context modules. All right, that's the first half. Umbrella applications is next. So let's talk about umbrellas. So let's talk about why you want to use an umbrella application. There are several benefits, and some have been touched on earlier. So one of the things, you can develop each application on its own without any thought for the other applications, and you can kind of allocate different team members if you want into their own application. You can run the tests on each application individually, which is very useful. And then you end up with these explicit contracts between your applications. You're treating your applications like you would any other dependency. And this means you get the same kind of guarantees that you were earlier when we were using a context module from our controller. And you can also build releases as a for each part of the umbrella. So if you've got two applications there, maybe you got this admin interface that only a few people use in the sales department, and you got this API that's used by lots of people. You can, especially if you're using Distillery, which is the replacement for EXRM, you can say, these are the two apps I want you to build from the umbrella, and then you can deploy them and scale them independently. And you can also extract applications using git filter branch from your apps directory, and this will make a repo out of it with the whole Git history intact. And if that's something that you want to share between your other umbrella applications, then you can push that up and use it as a mixed dependency. Or if it's something that you think will be useful, you can push it to Hex. I know Hex will maybe support private packages at some point, and when it does, you could push it up as a private package and use it between your umbrella applications. There are some potential downsides, it's arguably more complicated. You can't see at a glance where to go for the code. If you've only got an HTTP request, then you have to go into the web part and then find the root in the router and then find the controller that matches it and then see, it's using this application and then go over there. So it can be a little bit more tricky to find things. And it can be harder to test the entire test suite as well. There are things that, for example, if you've got one application in your umbrella that starts up and registers itself under a name, and then you've got another application that's using that as a dependency, it starts up and it tries to register the same name, then you'll get a collision. And you also maybe have applications started when you don't expect them to start. And the other big one is dependency conflicts can be harder to resolve. So maybe you got one application using Poison 1.5 and one using Poison 1.2. You're going to have to use the override true flag liberally to pick one. And developing new features as well means you have to touch multiple applications. So if you've got a new HTTP request or endpoint you need to implement, then you have to go in the web application and do it, and then you have to go into like the other application and add it there, and then you may have to go into like your authentication application. It's a weird phrase. And then add it in there. So you kind of have to touch many siblings to get implemented. So should you use an umbrella application? There's not a good answer. It depends. If you have something small that may not benefit, then it could cause more harm than good. But whenever I'm building a new application, I always reach for an umbrella first because it's really easy to go back if you don't like it. And you can have an umbrella application with one application in there, if you plan on it being bigger in the future. The good news is you don't need to decide today. Again, you don't need to go and call your team after this and tell them you need to use umbrellas. Moving code around Elixir is very easy. You take the code and you move it, and you're done. Moving code between applications is quite easy. You may have dependencies, which is the other thing you need to consider. But again, it's just moving the code. And it's possible to go the other way as well. Maybe you've got an umbrella application and you want to collapse it down into a single application for some reason that I don't know. Then it's totally possible, and you can do that. So you're not tied to whatever you choose. OK, so let's talk about how you convert your existing application to an umbrella application. So obviously, the first step is to create a new application, even though you've already got one. And the reason this is a better way, in my opinion, of doing this is it reduces noise, because you won't have a commit that just moves everything 2 directories down and creates this new root directory. But I'll get on to why I do it this way as I go. But yeah, so create a new application. And then we want to rename. We already have this mix file. Because our application is called oxo, we've got this oxo.mix file. And if we go ahead and do this and then try and import it, we'll get a name collision because we'll have 2 files with the same mix file. So I usually rename this like .platform.mix file or .umbrella.mix file, something generic that represents what it's doing. And then we need to set up Git. Git's going to be really important because I like to talk about it, but also because it's vital for the next step. So if you're using SVN, then I have no idea how you do this, but don't. So we'll set up the repository, and then we'll make a commit because it's good to commit before you make changes. You want to keep your commits quite small, and then you can squash them later. You can go the other way and unsquash commits, but it's a lot more work. You have to interactive rebase, so kind of start small. And what we do is we could just CP the directory across, right? And that'd be fine, but it would lose our Git history. And we've spent months writing commits of like fix X and clean up. And we've got all these amazing commits that we want to preserve. And if we do this, then we'll lose the ability to, for example, git blame. So you can find who wrote a particular piece of code and politely ask them why it works in a certain way. Or even better, just reading the commit message, because it'll be in there, right? Or my favorite git command, we should all have a favorite. Mine is bisect, and this is for finding bugs. So maybe there's a bug being introduced, and you need to know where it was introduced, and it's on the master branch. So you'll mark the master branch as bad, and then you're like, oh, this is working in v1.2. So you'll check out v1.2 and mark that as good. And then it'll do like a binary search between the commits, and it'll be like, hey, the commit was introduced in this commit here, introduced the bug. Well, it doesn't say that. It just says this is the commit that you're looking for. It might not be a bug. It could be something else. But if you just CP it again, you've got this massive import commit, and it doesn't really make much sense. It's difficult to find anything in there. And there's a better way that's pretty cheap as well, so I would use that. And the better way is it's called git subtree. And the way git subtree works, it's unlike a git submodule, which is like a reference to a commit somewhere. A git subtree will import the code into your directory, and it will do so by maintaining the git history. And you can subtree merge more than once as well, so maybe you've got like a long-running application in a different repo somewhere. You can keep subtree merging it in to keep it updated. And the way subtree add works is you add a remote, and then you fetch the remote, and then you call subtree add, and you specify a prefix, and the prefix is the destination for the application. And I've called mine Oxo Web in this case because there's kind of more web stuff than non-web stuff. But if there wasn't, I've got all the config in there. I've got my endpoint and stuff. So that's why I've called it Oxo Web. But if it was the other way around, I might choose a different application name. And the important thing to note is not only is the entire history preserved, it's preserved in the original Shaz as well. So if you've got maybe references on GitHub to a commit, then that link will still follow through. So we need to update the app config as well. We're now in umbrella mode, so we need to tell our app, hey, you're in umbrella mode. And it's pretty easy. There's just a few things you need to modify to make it work. So build, deps, and lock file are all so you can use the root level ones, so they're shared between all the applications. And this will speed up your compilation time, so you don't have a build and a deps directory per application. And as of Elixir 1.2, we can now share the config as well. So prior to this, the way you'd share config is you'd go into your application, you'd import the config from the other application. It was a bit clumsy. And the way it works now is you've got this config. You can point to the root config in the umbrella, and by default, that will cascade through all the children in the umbrella and import the config. And what this allows you to do is if you've got a web application that uses the database at some point, then it won't be configured, but you can, if you do this, it'll import the config from the app that does know how to configure the database, and you'll be able to use it. You can also get MV your lock file up, mix.lock. Yeah, you can, there's a space there, but you can move it up 2 directories, and that means that the lock file you've been using before can be used for the Umbrella application. You want to check everything works as well. It's pretty important that this change hasn't broken anything. So you can run mix-deps-get and mix-test, and all your tests will pass, because all you've got now is an application with one umbrella in it. No, an umbrella with one application in it, and that's fine. You want to hope everything works, but it won't, because when you run mix Phoenix at server, you'll realize that you've forgotten to build the static assets. So they're in this directory. You'll need to run npm install from there, and then it'll look right. So after we've got this umbrella application with one application in there, what we want to do is look to split it out into 2 applications. And because of all the things we did in the first half of the talk, it's going to be really easy. Everything's already kind of ready to go. So web stays in the web application, and everything that's not web-related goes. So you probably know what I'm talking about here. And we want to remove the concerns of other dependencies as well. So you don't want to fetch in and use the dependencies of another application, because they're not your dependencies. You shouldn't be using them. If you want to use it, add it to your own application. So in this case, come on in, which is a password hashing library. That will be in like what I like to call the core application, which is what contains all the domain logic and the other applications like the web application. So the web application shouldn't be hashing passwords. It can call the core application to check that the password is valid, but it shouldn't be doing it directly. And the same thing goes for config. You should config each application for itself. You shouldn't configure other applications in there. And you want to make sure you move the tests as well, because the tests will probably still work because all the module names are correct, but you won't be testing the application that you think you're testing. So it's a good idea to move them along as well. So the way we can do this is we can create a new application. It's a supervised application. That's why we're using the sup flag. And we want to add this application as a dependency in the web application. We can do this using the in-umbrella option on the config. And that will tell Mix that this is another sibling in my umbrella. And you also need to add it to the applications list, although there is some talk on the mailing list about maybe not having to do this. So if you read the mailing list, you'll know what I'm talking about there. If not, go read the mailing list. It's on there. You want to move the database config as well. So when you start a Mix application, unlike when you run Mix Phoenix new, you only get one environment. So you want to make sure that you've replicated the dev, test, and production environments as well. So you want to move over all the config files. You've got Ecto repos, which is a new thing in Ecto 2, which is a list of repos that your application uses. And in there, you'll want to make sure the web application's got an empty list and the application actually has a repo, has its repo. And this allows it, so when you run like a mix ecto command from the root, it knows which repo to use. And you want to, like I say, update the dependencies as well. So the database dependencies for ecto and anything that ecto's using, you want to move across. And you want to make sure you've got, in the web application, you don't want a repo supervisor, and in the core application you do, so move it. And then you want to move the tests over as well. And this is, by the way, why we renamed everything to oxa.web, because now the web application is namespaced, so everything that's not there can go. And if we move the tests over again, because if your commit has got failing tests, it's not a good commit. So make sure all your commits are a working build. We'll copy the database case over. We need to update the Elixir CPath and MixEXS as well. And what this means is in Phoenix, when you start generate a new application, there's this Elixir CPaths, and in there it's the path that will be compiled. And the important one we need from there is test support, and that ensures that the modules you're using for your tests are compiled as well. And update the test helper so it's using the correct repo checkout and the sandboxing that Ecto provides. Once you've done that, your directory structure will now look like this. So we've got 2 applications. We've got the OXO, which is our core application, OXO Web, which is our web application, and it's only got the web and anything web related like the assets, and the other application's got all the logic in there and the migrations as well. So just to summarize migrating your application to an umbrella, it's not too difficult. I'm not going to tell you how many story points it is, but in my opinion, it's not too difficult. And you can do it in a way that, again, I don't want to bang on about Git, but I really do. You can do it in a way that preserves your entire Git history. So everything, if you do write good commit messages, you'll get the benefits there. And again, use grep, check your OXO Web repo, or your application. There shouldn't be any repos in there. The one exception, you may use it in your tests, but what I tend to do in this case is in my core application, I will have like in the test support directory some helpers that are like create user, or create account, or create player. And then using a combination of that and the public functions I expose in my domain application, I've got enough there that I can write good tests without reaching for a repo directly. So going forward, there can be more than 2 applications. I've used 2 in this because it was an easy example, but you can have many more. You have as many as you want. And you want to try and think in applications as well, and the same you want to kind of try and think in contexts or domains. So try and isolate them so that they only do one thing and do it well. And you want to split out your common functions into their own applications as well. So things like authentication is a good candidate for moving out into its own OTP application. Same with email and notifications, like push notifications, those are a good candidate. And an application-specific example here, like I could have moved all my game logic out into its own application, and if I wanted to play from the terminal or something, that would have been fine. But it's more tricky to do if I don't isolate it. Yeah, and that's kind of all I've got. I'm Gazler. I'm the Gazler on Twitter because I didn't register my account until 2011. I work at a company called VoiceLayer. The code for my noughts and crosses GitHub thing. And someone asked me as well, this is the picture I use online, and someone asked me yesterday, are you the guy that eats Jenga? I just want to confirm, I don't eat Jenga. There's no nutritional value in it, but you can play it in your mouth. Thanks.
Check.
Question on the left there, behind the pillar.
Hello.
Hi.
So I got 2 Phoenix applications in my Umbrella app. One is just having an API which is separated out, and the other one is the main application. And the thing is, when I launch them, how would you do that, right? So I'm referencing one app, the main thing to have the same API URL structure, so I'm forwarding the router to the second application, so actually I don't need the second application running on its own port. And when I deploy it, is there a best practice around that, or?
Not really. Like you can, if you want to deploy it in a way that works on one server, then you can do what you're doing in forward. If you want to have it across multiple servers, it's not a problem. You have a load balancer somewhere that will redirect, certain paths to here and others to another place. One thing you can do, which I've done, is because your Phoenix applications are just functions that take a con and opt that plugs. What I've done before is built like a proxy module that is just a plug module, and in there I do some sort of match to say, does this path have API in it? If it does, go call this function. And if it doesn't call this, and then I've only got one application running as a server, and it only exposes one port, and it's forwarding to the other applications that way. One at the front here.
A question about controllers and channels. So do you see any major disadvantage, or I don't know, anything that would be wrong to export many of the controller functionality into the channels?
The controller functions largely revolve around using a con, and channels kind of less so. They're sort of persistent for handling events. So the APIs are similar, but probably quite different. So they're not similar, but they do different things. So so I'm not sure, really. Is that a good answer? I'm not sure. It's a great answer.
No, I was just thinking if, for example, trying to build let's say like a single page application, relying on the channels rather than on the controllers.
So yeah, you can do that. So if you build your applications in a way that like your domain modules, your domain logic is isolated in their own modules, then it doesn't really matter if you call that from a controller or a channel, you're going to get the same results. So you can easily build it in a way that you could, like, for example, handle registration over a WebSocket, but don't. But you could do that, and that'd be fine. Or you can also do it over a controller, and you can call the function either way.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
One last question. Hey, so if you've got a web application that depends on this sort of core domain application, and all the behavior of the web application depends upon what the core application returns. So like say, oh yes, you were successful in the request to create a user, or you were not successful. When you're testing the web layer, do you also run the domain logic code, or do you like inject something else in place of that that just returns those success or fail messages?
I'll probably run both to make sure that the response is correct, but there's less like, you don't need to test all your edge cases, you just need to check the paths that are in your controller if you want to get good coverage. An integration test is probably the correct level of testing there for that.
Cool, okay, thanks.